Okay, everybody, it's Kevin Lockett once again. Today, we are talking to a gentleman who wrote this amazing book, How Coppola Became Cage. The first 15 years of Nicolas Cage. Zach Schonfeld, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. So what made you decide to write about the first 15 years of Nick Cage's career? Because you could have wrote about his whole career because it's so interesting, but you chose his beginning half before The Rock. So what made you decide to focus on that part?
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by origin stories, how a certain artist or icon got started. And Cage has quite a dramatic and, quite a colorful origin story coming from the Coppola family. He's, as most people are aware, he's the nephew of Francis Ford Coppola. He's the grandson of the composer Carmine Coppola, and he spent the early years of his career kind of embroiled in this complicated, like, love-hate relationship with the Coppola family. And, on one hand, he changed his name because he was determined to distance himself from his famous uncle. But then on the other hand, he, eagerly accepted roles in his uncle's movies, which was part of what boosted his career. I wanted to write a book that really functions as a deep dive into Cage's early years. Cage, he's been in a lot of movies, particularly over the last decade. At this point, he has more than 100 film credits, to his name. The last decade has been rough for him. He's been really pumping out like straight to video on demand movies in order to pay off his many debts. I wanted to early in the early years of his career, his batting average was a lot higher. If you look at the movies that he made in the 80s and in the early 90s, most of the movies are, if not, a lot. He did a lot of great movies in those years: Moonstruck, Raising Arizona, Birdie, Vampire's Kiss, Wild at Heart. But even the bad movies that he made early in his career are at least interesting because they show him trying something new that he hasn't done before, or they show him like trying to figure out who he is as an actor. For example, he did a series of romantic comedies in the early 90s, which he refers to as his Sunshine trilogy. He did A Honeymoon in Vegas, It Could Happen to You, and Guarding Tess, all of which are kind of lighthearted mainstream Hollywood comedies. And I don't think those are the most memorable movies he's ever done. Those movies don't get talked a lot. They don't get talked about very much when people bring up Nicolas Cage, but they were interesting for the purposes of this book because they show this period where Cage is trying to figure out who he is as an actor, what he wants to be. And he, decided to dabble in, playing more likable, more almost everyman type characters in the style of Jimmy Stewart or Tom Hanks. And so this was a period where Cage was really trying to figure out who he is as an artist, and kind of jumping around from genre to genre and, exploring different modes of performance, exploring different styles of acting. And it's, I think the book is about a young actor trying to figure out who he is. And I found that quite interesting.
Something is interesting is what Ethan Hawke said about him. He said there's only been two actors to him that did something new when it comes to acting. And it was Marlon Brando, of course, people love Brando, and Nicolas Cage. And it's an interesting take because most people, when they say like, who's your favorite actors or who inspired you, Nicolas Cage's name never comes up. But what do you think about Ethan Hawke saying that there's only been two actors who's brought something new to acting, Brando and Cage?
Yeah. Okay. So the quote that he said, I believe, was that Nicolas Cage is the only actor since Marlon Brando who's done anything new with the art of acting. And what Ethan Hawke meant, what he was trying to say is that he felt like Ethan Hawke and his cohort of actors, they were all kind of falling in line with this 70s style of, I guess, real, the 70s style of realism, trying to achieve a film performance that mimics reality and I think most critics generally, they view film performances under the criterion of like, does this look naturalistic? Does this look like how a person behaves in real life? And Cage, early in his career, Cage decided that he wanted to rebel against that. He wanted to rebel against the whole idea of naturalism, and he started giving these performances that were much more surrealistic and distorted. In Peggy Sue Got Married, for instance, he modeled his character's voice after a talking horse from a cartoon program. In Vampire's Kiss, his whole performance is modeled after silent, actors from the silent cinema era of the 1920s, especially the German Expressionist movement in filmmaking. And, in that film, Cage gives these very almost high contrast, distorted body movements. And he conveys a lot with his character's extreme expressionistic body movements, which is not how, modern film actors typically approach acting. Cage was doing something different. And I think part of what makes him interesting as an actor is that he's really veered away from his peers. He's veered away from the whole Brat Pack generation of 80s movie stars. He's always been trying to do something different. And when you read interviews with him, like from this period of his career in the 80s, he talks about artists like Picasso, and he talks about how Picasso can get away with drawing these bizarre abstract drawings where like his wife's mouth stretches all the way to the floor. And Cage would say things like, why can't you do that with film performance? Why can't you do that with acting? So Cage has really been rebelling against the commonly accepted mode of what constitutes a good or acceptable film performance. And that's part of what made him so interesting to write about, is that he saw himself not only as an actor early in his career, but he almost saw himself as a pioneer. I think in one interview, he described himself as a pioneer on the frontier. He saw himself as this guy who was really rebelling against what everyone else thought about acting, and he was trying to do things his own way. And that's what makes him interesting. And I think, that's what Ethan Hawke was really responding to.
Right. One of the people, when I was going through the book, it's like, early on, he was very method. And it's like, when I was reading, it's like, man, he reminds me of a lot of Sean Penn, reminds me of Sean Penn's acting. And then lo and behold, him and Sean Penn were actually friends. But sadly, they had a falling out later, especially when Nick started to do blockbusters, because I think Penn was basically saying Cage is more of a performer than an actor now. Let's talk about the relationship between Sean Penn and Nicolas Cage, who almost were very similar in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Nick and Sean, Nick met Sean very early in his career. So Cage's very first movie, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Sean Penn obviously has a big role in that film. It was one of Sean Penn's breakout roles. And Cage did not have a big role. Cage was almost like a glorified extra. But Sean Penn was very much a method actor. And Sean Penn would try to remain in character 24/7. He would insist that everyone on set call him by his character's name. He would get angry if anyone called him Sean. And, to the point that he would insist that his trailer would have to, the name tag on his trailer would have to say his character's name rather than Sean Penn. And so Cage quietly observed Sean Penn's techniques, and the two actors, they worked together a couple years later on a movie called Racing with the Moon, which came out in 1984. One of Cage's first ever serious dramatic roles. And Sean Penn and Nicolas Cage, they played best friends in this movie. It's kind of a coming of age period piece set in the 1940s. So they play best friends, and they kind of became best friends in real life while they were making the movie. And, I make the case in the book that Sean Penn's method acting techniques really rubbed off on Nicolas Cage, because by the time Cage filmed this movie with Sean Penn, Cage started, parroting all the method acting quirks that Sean Penn had. So Cage would stay in character 24/7. He would try to live, inside of his character and do what his character would do, and he insisted that everyone on set address him by his character's name. And Cage, he kind of ran into trouble with this extreme commitment to method acting. So right after Racing with the Moon, Cage went into the movie The Cotton Club, directed by his uncle Francis Ford Coppola. And if you've seen The Cotton Club, you would know that Cage plays quite a violent, unsavory kind of character in that film. Cage plays a homicidal, violent gangster who goes on a rampage and accidentally, kills a child, and it's a very, very vicious character. And so Cage is trying to stay in character, and the shoot for The Cotton Club dragged on for months and months and months. And so Cage is trying to inhabit the character of this homicidal gangster. And so he goes around New York. At one point he trashed his trailer because he thought that's something that his character would do. At one point, he's walking around set, kicking and denting period automobiles because he was trying to summon the aggression and the rage of his character. And he got himself into trouble. I mean, people really got mad at Cage because of how reckless and erratic he was on the set of The Cotton Club. And his excuse for that was I was only trying to remain in character. I was only trying to do what my character would do. But when you're playing such a despicable character, I mean, you can at a certain point you can't live. I think Cage, later reflecting on that period in his career, he said to an interviewer, I wanted to inhabit my character in The Cotton Club, but I could only do it for a few weeks because otherwise I'd be in jail by now.
Right. So what was the pivot? Because he was very method. And then by the time we get to Leaving Las Vegas, which he won the Oscar, he became more of an observant type actor. Which film did he decide to move away from being so method? Was The Cotton Club experienced the pivot point, or was it another film where he decided to go another direction?
Yeah. I mean, I would say he was still kind of a method actor even later in his career when he did Leaving Las Vegas, but he wasn't quite as uncompromising and extreme about it. I think the experience of The Cotton Club, as well as Birdie is a film that he did directly after The Cotton Club. And when he did Birdie, he was playing a Vietnam War veteran, and his character is a guy who comes back from Vietnam, and his he was injured and his face was partially blown off in an explosion. And so Cage insisted on wearing these bandages on his face 24/7. Even when he was sleeping, he would wear these bandages. And the makeup artists on set got really frustrated with him because they wanted, to apply makeup to his face, and he wouldn't take the bandages off. And he was really trying to inhabit this anguish and pain that his character was feeling. And he found it to be a very emotionally draining experience making that film. He just felt like it was exhausting. And so I think that 1-2 punch of Cotton Club and Birdie kind of made him realize that you can't inhabit your character 24/7 or you'll go insane. But he still did some pretty wacky stuff even after that. I mean, Vampire's Kiss, he insisted on swallowing a live cockroach because he thought that would make the movie more, authentic. And he also fought with the producers of Vampire's Kiss because he wanted them to use a real live bat in the scene where his character gets attacked by a bat. So he was obsessed with capturing this kind of authenticity in his performances, which, I think that's part of what made him an interesting subject for a book. And it's part of what made this early period in his career interesting to me to focus on, is because he took every performance to the extreme, and he was so committed to achieving this extreme authenticity in every performance. He really wanted to live as these wacky kind of insane characters who he was playing.
So 1987 was a pivotal year because he made Raising Arizona and Moonstruck, but he almost didn't get Moonstruck because the producers or the director, I can't remember which, they wanted Peter Gallagher. But Cher really wanted Nick Cage, and by that point, Nick Cage was not a huge star. Why was Cher really pushing for Nick Cage in that role?
Yeah, Cher watched Cage's performance in Peggy Sue Got Married, and that was quite a polarizing performance. That's the movie where he spends the entire film speaking in this nasally, this kind of nasally cartoonish voice, which he modeled after the claymation horse from Gumby. And for whatever reason, Cher loved his performance in Peggy Sue Got Married. She said something. There's something, I think it's in Cher's memoir, where she wrote something like, "I felt like any actor who was willing to show his ass like that in a movie, like, that's the kind of actor we needed in Moonstruck." And she said that I'm trying to find the quote because it's a really funny quote. Here it is. Cher wrote, "I thought that anybody who had the guts to expose his ass like that was the right person to play Ronnie Camilleri. The first time I read the line, 'Give me the big knife. I want the big knife,' I could only hear him saying it." So Cher, she really went to bat for Cage. The producers were, or the studio was not comfortable with Cage getting that role in Moonstruck. They wanted Peter Gallagher, as you mentioned. I think they were worried that Cage wasn't a box office draw because Birdie had not done well at the box office, and some of his other movies had also flopped at the box office by that point. So they were nervous. Cage was kind of a wild card. And Cher really fought for him, and at one point she threatened to back out of the movie if they didn't give the role to Cage. So we definitely have Cher to thank for Cage's performance in Moonstruck.
Right. So I think one of the tragedies of Nicolas Cage's career is that he didn't have a consistent go-to director. Like DiCaprio and De Niro, they have Scorsese. Denzel Washington, he had Tony Scott, Spike Lee, Antoine Fuqua. Cage only worked with one director twice. That was his uncle Francis.
No, he worked with Francis. He worked with several directors twice. Francis is one of only two directors who he worked with 3 times.
Oh, 3 times. Okay, 3 times.
Yeah.
Okay. But some of his greatest performances probably was like with the Coen brothers, Raising Arizona, and then also with David Lynch. I think it's David Lynch. I think David Lynch, right?
Yeah, Wild at Heart.
Wild at Heart. Yeah. Wild at Heart. But he never worked with those two again. And both of them have both those guys have 2 different ways. Coen brothers are very stick to the script type guys like Tarantino, while Lynch is kind of like, try whatever you want. Tell me about the contrast between those 2 directors, or those 3, I guess 3 directors, between the Coen brothers and David Lynch with Nick Cage.
Yeah, so the Coen brothers are, as you mentioned, they write every line of dialogue that appears in their films, and they do not like it when actors improvise or ad-lib. They really prefer that actors deliver the lines exactly the way that it's written in the script. And they are meticulous. I mean, at least early in their career, they storyboarded every scene. They came to set incredibly well prepared. They knew how to achieve these kinds of shots on a low budget, and Raising Arizona obviously was a low budget movie. And so Cage is the kind of actor who very much likes to make each character his own. He comes to set with his own ideas. This is what I think my character would do here. Or he likes to come up with kind of wacky lines that he could bring to the script. And the Coen brothers they just weren't really down with that. There was some friction. There was some clashing between Cage and the Coens. there's one article that I quoted in my book. David Edelstein, famously of New York Magazine, actually visited the set of Raising Arizona when that movie was being shot, and he interviewed Nicolas Cage on set. And it's quite a revealing piece because Cage kind of talked a little bit of shit about the Coen brothers, and he said something to the effect of, like, you know, they have an autocratic vision and they don't like it when other people try to impose on their autocratic vision. And Cage, he was like, oh, but, like, you know, this is, you know, they're very young, they're starting out. I'm sure they'll, like, loosen up a little bit as they make more movies. And I don't think the Coen brothers really did change that much. I think they're absolutely brilliant, idiosyncratic filmmakers, but they are the kinds of filmmakers who come to set with a very clear idea about how everything in the script is going to work. And so there was some friction between them and Cage, which I suspect may be part of the reason that they have never worked with Cage again after Raising Arizona, but who knows? I mean, there might be more reasons at play. So David Lynch, on the other hand, David Lynch is much more open to, you know, things, you know, ideas, you know, coming up on the fly. David Lynch likes it when actors come to set with all these crazy ideas about how they can, you know, make a scene their own. And so, you know, Lynch talked a lot of stuff that's in Wild at Heart was not in the original script. And Lynch wrote the script based on the novel by Barry Gifford, but a lot changed after the script was written. So, for instance, the famous snakeskin jacket that Cage wears in Wild at Heart, which becomes this motif in the script, that was not originally in the script. That was a jacket that Cage actually bought for himself at a secondhand store. Just, you know, in LA, he just found that jacket and bought it and started wearing it. And I think he wore it to a rehearsal for Wild at Heart at David Lynch's house. And Lynch came up with this idea, like, oh, you should wear this jacket in the film. We should incorporate that into the script. And he did. Another idea that kind of emerged on the fly was the Elvis songs that are in Wild at Heart. I think Cage started delivering his lines in this kind of Elvis drawl, and he started modeling the entire performance after Elvis. And he and David Lynch were talking about Elvis Presley, and you know, they came up with the idea that Cage should actually do these musical numbers in the film and sing not one but two Elvis songs throughout that film. So, you know, Lynch is the kind of director who thrives on more of a improvisational kind of spur of the moment energy. And he and Cage really hit it off. They really had a very, very fruitful, very lively collaborative partnership on Wild at Heart. So for that reason, you know, you mentioned that Cage never worked with David Lynch again after Wild at Heart. And I thought that was kind of weird. And I had the honor of interviewing David Lynch for the book. And I asked him, you know, point blank, I asked him, you know, why haven't you worked with Cage ever again? And Lynch, his response was like, you know, he got a little defensive, and he was like, you know, it just wasn't right. We just didn't work together again, but I'd love to work with him again. You know, I'd work with him again tomorrow if I could. And I was like, yeah, you know, please be my guest. Please do work with him tomorrow. So Lynch didn't really have any reason why he hasn't worked with Nicolas Cage since Wild at Heart. And who knows? I mean, maybe there's still time.
Yeah, there's still time. What can't happen now is the Superman movie. When I went to see The Flash, they had an image in the movie of Nicolas Cage's Superman, his Superman that never was made. It was still to be Tim Burton was going to direct. And I mean, there's if you want to see it online, you can see Nick Cage's in the Superman suit. He was ready to go, and they pulled the plug. Yeah. How devastating was that to Nicolas Cage when they stopped their Superman movie?
It was very frustrating because that movie had been in development for years, and Cage had committed to the role of Superman, and it was very it was in very advanced stages of pre-production. I mean, Cage, you can see, as you mentioned, there are videos of him going to these costume fittings with Tim Burton and trying on the Superman suits that they designed for him. So they were, when Warner Brothers pulled the plug on that film, they were, I think, less than a month away from the planned start date for principal photographer. I think they were like weeks away from starting photography on that film. So that was very frustrating. You know, Cage had a once in a lifetime opportunity to play one of the superheroes whose comic books he grew up reading. And, you know, the rug was pulled out from under him. What was not frustrating about that experience is that I believe Cage still got paid his full salary for Superman Lives, which was something like $20 million. He because of his contract, he basically managed to get paid even though the film was canceled. So I'd love to get paid. I'd love to get paid $20 million to not star in a film. That seems pretty nice.
That seems pretty nice.
Yeah.
I've always been a fan of Sarah Jessica Parker since Square Pegs. I knew her long relationship with Robert Downey Jr. and flamed out because Robert had issues, and then she married Matthew Broderick. But somewhere in the middle there, which I had no idea, Nicolas Cage dated Sarah Jessica Parker. How in the world did that happen?
Yeah, so they starred in a movie together, Honeymoon in Vegas, the 1992 romantic comedy in which they play a couple. And I think one interesting aspect of being a method actor or being any kind of movie star is that you fall in love with your co-star. And this is something that happened to Cage multiple times. You know, starring in romantic movies, he would sometimes fall in love with his female co-star. When he did Valley Girl, he later admitted that he was very much in love with the actress Deborah Foreman, and they had a bit of a fling. And then when he did Honeymoon in Vegas and he's playing Sarah Jessica Parker's boyfriend, they fell in love during the making of that movie. And I didn't know this either before I started working on the book. But Cage, he dated quite a few famous women throughout the early years of his career. And yeah, he and Sarah Jessica Parker, they had a relationship. They dated for about, I think, the better part of a year after Honeymoon in Vegas wrapped. Obviously, it didn't work out. She wound up marrying Matthew Broderick, and Cage eventually wound up marrying Patricia Arquette, which did not last.
No, he was kind of chasing her over the years. Like it was,
yeah.
I thought, okay, he met Patricia, got married. No, he was actually interested in Patricia before.
He met her in Cantor's Deli in LA in the late 80s when she was like 19, very young. And he apparently told her, like, during their first meeting, he told her, like, I'm in love with you. I'm going to marry you. And she thought he was nuts. And he said, I'm serious. Like, let me prove my love to you. Like, give me a quest. Give me a way to prove my love. And so she sent him on this like wild like quest to prove his love, where he had to track down J.D. Salinger's autograph, and he had to track down a black orchid, and he had to go on this whole like treasure hunt. And he did it. He actually did track down some of these rare items in order to prove his love to Patricia Arquette, and they dated, and apparently, things got weird. It was too intense for her. I believe she was also in love with this other guy who she eventually had a child with. So it was complicated. Yeah. So they broke up, and then Cage fell in love with Sarah Jessica Parker, and also he dated this model named Kristen Zhang, for who I think he was briefly engaged to in the early 90s. And then years after his initial courtship of Patricia Arquette, in 95, he and Patricia Arquette reconnected, and they started chatting, and she was like, do you still want to get married? And he was like, yes. They hadn't dated in like 7 or 8 years. And she was like, do you still want to get married? And Cage was like, yes. And they made this spontaneous decision to get married, and they did. And Cage has had quite a bizarre love life. I think that about sums it up. He's had a very, very colorful and very strange romantic life.
Yeah, yes. But I think that kind of comes to the family lineage. Like, you could have wrote a complete book about the Coppola family, starting with his dad. Like, his dad was he was a professor or something like that, but he was the golden child of the family until Francis, his brother, made The Godfather. The relationship between Nick's mother and father is kind of crazy too, because his mother had some issues. And even Nick himself with his brother, there's issues there because they had a falling out over the years. Like, the whole Coppola family, there's a lot of drama within that family.
Yeah. So Cage's dad was a literary professor named August Coppola, who was kind of an eccentric professor kind of guy. August Coppola had this obsession with touch, and he designed the I'm trying to remember what it's called. He designed the tactile dome. He designed the tactile dome, which was an interactive exhibit at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. So he was obsessed with trying to understand dimensions of touch and, sensory experiences. And he was a literary professor who raised Cage on a steady diet of classic literature and classic films. I mean, Cage likes to talk about how when he was a kid, his dad would be showing him like Nosferatu and Fellini films while the other kids were going to see, Disney films. And so Cage had a very unusual upbringing. His mom suffered from pretty severe mental illness, I think schizophrenia or something of that nature. And starting when Cage was about 6 years old, his mom was institutionalized for long stretches of his childhood. So his dad, August Coppola, kind of had to raise the family on his own. But August was kind of a severe, emotionally distant kind of father who very much disapproved of Cage's Hollywood aspirations. And I think part of the reason why he disapproved of Cage's career aspirations is because August was kind of resentful of the fact that his brother Francis had become, an enormously successful, celebrated filmmaker. And after Francis achieved all this great success with The Godfather, then their sister Talia Shire became a very successful actress, best known for playing Connie in The Godfather. And their father, Carmine Coppola, the composer, he also achieved great success composing the score for The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2. So the whole thing, like after Francis became this big deal filmmaker, the whole family dynamic shifted, and like the Coppola family all of a sudden became this whole like Hollywood dynasty. And I think August had a lot of resentment around that, and he didn't like the fact that his whole family was, going into Hollywood, and he wanted Nick to be a writer or an academic like himself, and he kind of tried to mold Cage into being a writer, and there was a lot of tension between Cage and his dad, because Cage wanted to be an actor and his dad tried to discourage him from doing that.
It's kind of weird because even though his dad didn't want to become an actor, it's almost like his dad's fault this happened, because, like you said, his dad used to take him to see these old movies.
Right.
And an actor that influenced Nicolas Cage was James Dean. Now, most of these guys, like Sean Penn and Chris Maloney, they'll mention like Pacino, De Niro, Hoffman. Like these are the actors from that time period that they influenced most of these guys who are now in their 60s. But Cage was influenced by a guy who died. Great actor, but he died back in 1955. And I think Cage saw East of Eden or something like that when he was 14 years old.
Yeah, East of Eden is a movie that Cage says changed his life and made him want to be an actor. And, we were just talking about how Cage had daddy issues, and East of Eden is kind of like the all-time daddy issues movie, because James Dean plays this very angst-ridden teenager who is kind of desperate to win over his father's love. And there's a scene where James Dean has this breakdown because his father rejects the offering that James Dean gives him, and Cage has identified that scene as being like the scene that changed his life and made him want to become a film actor, and not just a film actor, but a dramatic actor. Like before he saw East of Eden, he loved comedy and he wanted to make people laugh. After he saw East of Eden, he was like, this is what I want to do. I want to be a movie star. I want to be a dramatic actor. I want to be just like James Dean.
I thought when he won the Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas, he decided to say, you know what, I'm going to cash out. I'm going to use this popularity I got now. I'm going to go make The Rock. That really didn't happen that way. He filmed Leaving Las Vegas. I think he was supposed to film another film called The Funeral, I believe, but it didn't work out. And he decided to do The Rock, which was totally different because he didn't do action films. What made him decide to do action films? Because up until that point, I don't think he did anything that was that blockbuster-ish type of film.
He tried with a movie called Firebirds, which is this kind of military themed movie where he plays a helicopter pilot. And that movie was a flop, and it was roundly ridiculed by critics, and rightfully so. It's not a good movie. It's kind of a ripoff of Top Gun. But that was Cage's first attempt to pivot into action movie hero mode, and it didn't work out. And then when The Rock came around, that was kind of the pivot point of his career. I think by that point he had fired his longtime agent Ed L'Amato, and he signed with a new agent. And he clearly wasn't happy with the roles that his agent was bringing him. He wasn't happy with all those kind of like mid-budget comedies that he was doing in the early 90s. He'd gotten somewhat disillusioned with comedy, and I think The Rock was the biggest salary that he'd gotten paid up to that point, and he clearly wanted to be making more money. He wanted to be an action star, and I think The Rock was the first time that the stars were kind of aligned for Nicolas Cage, blockbuster action hero. And part of why I chose to end my book with Leaving Las Vegas is because I felt like that was this major pivot point of Cage's career, where Leaving Las Vegas was a low budget movie that nobody thought would amount to anything. And then, it became this major critical success. Obviously, Cage won an Academy Award for Leaving Las Vegas. And after Leaving Las Vegas, he immediately shifted gears. It was like almost overnight, his career changed and he became this blockbuster action movie star. The Rock, Con Air, and Face Off. He did all three of those movies back to back. So that's basically the pivot point of Cage's career, where he all of a sudden he stopped doing these low budget art films and started doing these big Jerry Bruckheimer mainstream productions. And so it kind of made sense to me that my book is about this first phase of Cage's career, and that phase of his career ended right around 96 when he did The Rock.
I was very happy when I saw Nick Cage at the Oscars, because I was so upset with Hollywood. I always get upset with Hollywood when they seem to turn their back on actors. Like Brendan Fraser went through this period. Michael Keaton went through this period. And Robert Downey Jr. understood, because Robert Downey Jr. had the drug issues. But, Robert was kind of half one foot in, one foot out. But it's just like Hollywood's like, no, we don't like you guys anymore. Go away. But then Nick makes massive talents. And now he has this new renaissance. He's going to do Spider-Man Noir for Amazon Plus. That seems like that's going to be great. Yeah, I think he has this movie Longlegs coming out summer. What do you think of this now resurgence of Nicolas Cage? Because it seems like everything kind of stopped. He went to do all these other movies, but after Ghost Rider 2 seems like that was like the last big budget film he made, and then he went straight to DVD, straight to video type films. But what do you think of this new renaissance of Cage?
I think it's great. To me, it's not something I anticipated, because I started working on this book all the way back in 2020 when Cage was still kind of still kind of struggling. He was still not getting major roles. He was still pumping out a lot of these mediocre straight to VOD trash movies. So when I started working on this book, I was not anticipating that by the time I finished the book, there would be this whole like Cage-a-sance happening. I think the movie that really jump-started this career revival was Pig. I saw Pig. Pig came out in the summer of 2021 when I was really kind of in the thicket of working on this book and struggling to finish a draft and had no idea when I'd be able to, finish a draft of the book. I was struggling with it. And when Pig came out, I was so happy to see that Cage had given this I think, I'd say it's probably his best performance in at least a decade, if not more. And part of what I love about Pig is that you can see some parallels between the character who he plays in Pig and his own position within the industry, because he plays this this chef, this like formerly successful celebrity chef who has left it all behind and has kind of gone off to kind of live in the wilderness and he feels like his life is over and he's never going to be able to reclaim his past glories. There's a parallel there between the character and Cage himself and the position that he's been in terms of career struggles over the past decade. So I really liked Pig. And then Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent came out the following year. I did not love that movie. I kind of, in the epilogue of my book, I talk about that film and I kind of articulate some of my critiques of it. But then last year, 2023, Dream Scenario came out. And I thought that was another real comeback moment for Cage. I mean, that Dream Scenario I thought was a really sharp, really funny and inventive film. And Cage delivered a performance that was unlike anything he's done before, but it was just very much his own. It was just the kind of performance that we haven't seen from him in a long time. So it's been very gratifying to see him enjoy this career revival, and it feels like he's reminding people who he is and what he's capable of. He's reminding us that his career isn't over. He still has more work to do. He's delivering these performances that are not quite like any performances we've seen from him before. And obviously for me on a personal level, it's quite convenient that he achieved this comeback narrative right around the time that my book came out. So I'm very, very pleased to see that he's back in the Hollywood spotlight again.
Now, you asked him to be part of the book. He politely declined. What advice would you give people when they're writing a biography of an artist? Because most people can't get in touch with the artist themselves.
Yeah.
But what advice would you give someone if they want to do a biography on an artist or actor or musician?
Dig as deep as you can and talk to as many sources as you can who worked with that person. And as one piece of advice that I would give is don't just talk to the obvious people. Don't just talk to famous people. But when you're writing about Hollywood, I have personally found that it helps to interview people who are behind the scenes, whether it's a casting director or a first AD, second AD, a script supervisor. These people, we don't know their names because they're very much behind the scenes, but people who have some of the less talked about, less glamorous roles in Hollywood, they have stories to tell. And I interviewed a lot of people for this book. I interviewed somewhere around 120, 130 people about Nicolas Cage for this book. And some of the best interviews that I did for the book were with people that you've never heard of because they're just, they're not in the public eye. But they perform important roles behind the scenes of some iconic movies. And an example would be, in my experience, casting directors have incredible stories to tell. because they work very closely with filmmakers and with actors to try to, figure out who is the right actor for any particular role. So for instance, I interviewed the Coen brothers casting director who worked with them for like the first decade of their career. And she worked on Raising Arizona and Barton Fink and Hudsucker Proxy. And she introduced the Coen brothers to like Steve Buscemi and John Goodman. She had some wonderful stories about the whole saga of how the Coen brothers, first met Nicolas Cage and they were torn between him and Kevin Costner, and they were going back and forth on who they wanted to cast. She had such vivid and colorful memories of this like pivotal moment in the careers of both the Coens and Cage. I interviewed Cage's dialect coach on Raising Arizona, who had these like wacky stories of visiting Cage at his Hollywood apartment and working on the character's accent with him while his baby shark like swam around in his living room aquarium. I interviewed who else did I interviewed Cage's high school friends, people who went to Beverly Hills High with him back in the early 80s, and some of them had these wonderful stories of what it was like to be in an acting class with Cage in high school. And he had this like power struggle with their acting teacher. Their acting teacher would make them recite monologues from plays, and Cage would kind of troll the teacher by making up his own monologues and instead of like memorizing from the plays that he was supposed to be memorizing. I interviewed a lot of people. So my advice to anyone who's writing a biography is interview as many sources as you can, and try to find stories and anecdotes and insights that have not been surfaced before. Because I think when you're writing about a public figure, presumably someone who has been written about and talked about very much already, I think the prerogative is you really, in order to make the book worth anyone's time, you really need to find details and information and insights that are not already part of the public record. And that was what I strive to do with this book. I really wanted to write a book about Nicolas Cage where even the biggest Nicolas Cage fan in the world could read this book and there'll be tons of information that they don't already know.
All right. Let me end this question on this, because I was going to ask you something else, but you studied Cage for a long time. Let's say I'm new to Nick Cage. Maybe I've only seen one Nick Cage movie. If I was a beginner Nick Cage films, what 5 films should I watch to get the true essence of Nicolas Cage?
Damn, that's hard. Okay, so let's go chronologically. I think Moonstruck. Actually, no. Let's start with Raising Arizona. Raising Arizona is one of his iconic movies of his early career. I think Moonstruck has this. I think Moonstruck shows the best of his comical abilities. It has this frenetic, cartoonish energy to it. It's maybe. I think Raising Arizona and Vampire's Kiss are kind of tied as my personal favorite Cage performances. Vampire's Kiss is my second choice, or the second movie that I would suggest. Vampire's Kiss is really the movie where he establishes this whole like surrealistic framework for performance, where he's riffing on the silent cinema of the 1920s. He's giving this like expressionistic style of performance that he intended to be a rebellion against, realistic, naturalistic acting. And it's Vampire's Kiss is just like the ultimate cult movie, in my opinion. It's like the ultimate example of a movie that bombed at the box office, but like watch it with a crowd today at a midnight screening and people go crazy for it. It's such a fun and such a dark and such a deranged movie. Moonstruck is a classic. Moonstruck is the movie where Cage really showed his romantic side, and he has a romantic side. He is kind of a hopeless romantic. And his chemistry with Cher in that movie is unbelievable. It's rightfully a classic. It's the only Nicolas Cage movie that's ever been nominated for Best Picture. I would also recommend Leaving Las Vegas, which I think incredible performance. It's not an easy movie to watch, but it's just such a he poured everything into that performance, and I think you can tell. And I think it's such a dark and haunting movie, but part of what makes it great is that he brings this levity to it and this almost madcap comical energy to it. I think Leaving Las Vegas is undeniably one of his greatest performances. And obviously it's the movie for which he won an Academy Award. And so that's 4. So I get one more.
You get one more.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Face Off. Face Off, yeah. Face Off is almost like this acrobatic acting exercise where Cage has to play. Really, he plays two different characters in one film. I mean, he's playing himself with his own face, and he's also playing John Travolta's character with Nicolas Cage's face. And the way he manages to inhabit the physicality of both characters is incredible. And of course, I think Cage, to many people, Cage is known as a 90s action hero. I mean, that is his legacy, is that he achieved this blockbuster status with the trilogy of, it's kind of the holy trilogy of The Rock, Con Air, and Face Off. That's kind of the action trilogy that turned Cage into an A-list blockbuster action star overnight. And of the action movies that he's made, I think Face Off is the pinnacle. It's the gold standard. I love Face Off. I feel bad that I didn't name any movies from like the 21st century. I didn't name any movies that he's done in the past 25 years. But you limited me to 5, so those are my 5.
Yeah, blame me. Yeah. If you write another book, we'll tackle the 21st century.
Sure. Movies. Obviously, right. Where my head is at is more in this early stage of his career.
That's cool. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Zach. That's a good way to end the conversation. Thanks a lot, Zach.
Thank you. Pleasure talking.
Pleasure here.
Bye.